talking for the next 2 times we're here, and we'll go from there. So now we're back on the clock, and we're going to start with digestive. So there it is. Yes, I know I'm presenting to everyone. So you may, I don't know if you had it or not. I'm just focusing on the anatomy. Biggest problem students have is they mistake digestion for absorption. They're not the same. Digestion is breaking the stuff down. It occurs mechanically, which is physical breakdown or mechanical breakdown, and chemically. Absorption is bringing it in to the lining cells, principally in the small intestine, and going through those cells into the bloodstream or the lymph and processing. That's what happens. And so ingestion, digestion, both types, absorption, very specific, and should say bloodstream or lymph, because eventually they all go to the bloodstream. And then whatever left over, we expel. The first notion is that with fecal matter is not just undigested food, which is a big mistake. The lining cells in your gut, you replace about 1 billion of those every day between your stomach, your small, and your large intestine. Most of what you're expelling is about a third, not most, about equal parts, third water, third cells, third food, undigested food. So people have a mistaken notion about that anyway. I'm just bringing you that to amplify it. This is one of the systems that you're going to see the same in urinary, and you're going to see the same in renal, where we have effectively a major structure and accessory structures. In this case, the major structure is a hollow tube, the alimentary canal. It's a tube, an opening. My analogy for that always has been like a spool of thread. The hole in the spool of thread that you put on a sewing machine, if that's what you were doing with it, is the alimentary canal from your mouth to your anus. Until it goes passes that whole interior, then it is technically inside your body. So it's really, even though we eat something, say, oh, I put that inside, you didn't. Not until it's digested and absorbed. Sometimes you can get problems on any of those ends, the ingestion and the absorption, the digestion and the absorption, or the elimination. So it's just a tube with muscle. That's where the interesting stuff kind of starts. Digestion, absorption. So all of these structures are part of it. That's the main alimentary canal. It's a tube that starts like this, twists, turns, rolls on itself, folds. It's designed to do that. It's designed for the most part, once you get into the stomach, small and large intestine, to move around freely. It's covered in a moist lining, so it can do that. You in the nursing program are going to listen to bowel sounds. When they're lying in bed, a patient, you should hear little plinks and plunks with your stethoscope. That's a good thing, because that's when bowel sounds are supposed to be there. The absence of those is bad. Everything else is accessory. We're not going to do the teeth. We're not going to do the tongue. We are going to do the gallbladder. We're going to talk briefly about salivary glands. We'll talk a fair amount about the liver and a little bit about the pancreas. So, and it's and we'll probably see this illustration again, the label. So the tube, what's the distance between here and here for most of us? 2 to 3 feet. How long is that tube if you took it and stretched it out? 25 to 30 feet. The amazing thing about this tube is that your intestines alone, your small intestine alone, about 20 feet, with all the elaborate folding and pleating and tiny projections and additional tiny projections, that has, if you could stretch those all out magically, they would fill this room. So it would be like a garden hose, roughly 1 inch wide, 3/4 to 1 inch wide garden hose that you'd slit like you were slitting down a hose with a sharp blade and spread it out. Not a lot of surface area, but if you found all the useful surface area, it would be the size of a tennis court. There's a ton of absorptive area. So there's a lot of anatomical design. I love that. So, the first thing is there's a consistent pattern with smooth muscle. We talked about it a little bit in A and P1. The hollow tube, and like in any hollow tube, it's called lumen. So that hollow tube, the exterior, after we get to all the lining and stuff like that, is basically two kinds of muscles. Circular muscles, close to the hole, longitudinal muscles outside the hole. They work sequentially. They squeeze, push, squeeze, push. That remarkable motion is called peristalsis. It's continuous. When you get into the small intestinal area and beyond, they do a little back and forth. That's called segmentation. See the illustration. It's all about the arrangement of the muscles. Circular, close to the center, that squeezer, the longitudinal push it along. In some areas, you have additional muscle. The stomach, you have a layer that's even deep to the circular layer, that's at an angle, it's oblique. It brings it over and back, over and back, over and back. The stomach's all about mixing. It's a giant bag for mixing stuff. I have a very large scar that goes from my xiphoid process down below my umbilical. Not one, but two giant surgeries, 8 hours in duration. Where they have removed half of my stomach, not once, but twice. Rerouted the whole thing. So I'm very in touch with my digestion. But as you can see, it hasn't caused me to be sick. There's a smile here. We're too quiet. We need to get a little more. Some of us are the other way. I can't, look, I finally decided to.
I know.
Why is he picking on her? I see her once. I actually saw and spoke to Kate. You saw her right there, I know. So here it is. Peristalsis, segmentation. This book calls it mechanical breakdown and then digestion. To me, it's mechanical and chemical. That's lecture, not lab. Absorption, blood or lymph, which is correct. It's a good little schematic. And you can see I'm going through this relatively expeditiously because I do want to cover it. And I don't want to keep you here inordinately long. So most of the time it's moving along. You see, green is propulsion. So almost entirely your mouth, stomach is really all about moving it and mechanically breaking it down. There's a little bit of chemical activity, but mostly mechanical. See, green is propulsion, blue is the mechanical, as you can see, really accentuating the stomach. When we get here, digestion and absorption. So first thing that's unique about this, we've had heart, we've had lung, you have a liner around the organ called visceral peritoneum. You have a liner on the wall called parietal peritoneum. By definition, these are serous, meaning they are moist, so they can slide. That's where the nuance ends, okay? What's unique about that is this, the visceral peritoneum. It's as though it's in double layer, that's a sandwich. And in the middle of that sandwich, like my phone here, in between my palms, is blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics. That sandwich with a moist lining on the exterior is called mesentery. And what it does is supply all those areas with entry and exit points for blood vessels and nerves and lymphatics, and it organizes them so that they're always in the right relationship, because a lot of it looks relatively complex. So here's the mesentery, a double layer, all that good stuff in it, holds them in place. Fat storage is minimal, I would think. So and all of the organs that can do that and move freely are called intraperitoneal. Some organs act as stability points. The mesentery is absorbed to the back wall, and it becomes part of the back wall. When we get to the kidney, it's in that area. It secures it, as do the ureters, urethra, the ureters, and the bladder. They call that retroperitoneal. It's like if you we're working on a cadaver, and you turn the cadaver over and lifted it up, those organs that are intraperitoneal would kind of flop out. The retroperitoneal ones are stable to the back of the wall. There's a part of the small intestine that's stable there. Okay. couple of parts of the large intestine are stable there. That's about it. They're stable points to kind of hold it in place. One's very important. So here's retroperitoneal. The pancreas, very important. Without it, you can't digest sexual. Stable there. The duodenum, because that's where the pancreas and the liver, all the fluids from there enter in the single most important part of your entire digestive tract. It's called, in the old days, it called the common bile duct. Now it's called the hepato for liver, pancreatic for pancreas duct. Okay? And it's controlled by a sphincter that allows those secretions to come in. As long as you got that, you're in business eating, drinking, digesting, and absorbing. When I had my second surgery, when I was losing, I don't know, untold amounts of blood in my internally from ulcers, the first thing they did was a CT scan to make sure that was still intact. If it had not been, one, I probably wouldn't be here today. Two, I would have no longer been able to eat. I would have effectively had to have a gastronomy to be fed that way for the rest of my, most likely somewhat limited life. Not nearly as enjoyable. You would have had the displeasure for me to cause you to be dyspeptic. So this is what I mean. Normally it's here. Now the liver's kind of neat because it's got a double layer because it kind of is adherent to the front wall. And here's retroperitoneal where it's and it's a sterile area, that internal. So when there's a rupture, like an ulcer or an appendix, probably the classic case, gets in this sterile area, it's nasty. Because inevitably it's filled with gram negatives. And for micro, you should know that they're endotoxins, and that's bad. That's life-threatening. The most unique part, everything else is threes. Respiratory, lining cell, retina, nerve, vascular layer, outer layer, blood vessel, smooth muscle, liner, external tissue. This got four. Why has it got four? Because it's so busy. Normally you have the outer lining, the serosa, what's called the muscularis externa, that's circular and longitudinal muscles. And normally you would just have liner, but that liner has to digest, has to absorb, has to be able to protect you, has to be able to interact with the food, has to produce chemicals that help to break it down or digest it, any way you want to discuss it. So because it's so complex, it actually has three layers. It has its own underlayer called the submucosa that's dedicated to supporting it, housing some of the glandular structures, having additional nerve supply and blood supply. So it's got a really complicated layer. So we're going to talk about the mucosa. It's protective, and everything around here is pH controlled. The stomach is acidic, so the mucus has to be alkaline to neutralize it. It has to deal with enzymes and hormones. Okay, there has to be the ability to absorb in almost all of these areas, and because this is a passageway from the outside, bacteria, viruses, toxins. There's so many food-borne illnesses, a ton. In micro, you're talking about them. We're going to get it in my class. We'll get into the diseases, but we'll talk about food-borne illnesses. Some of them potentially life-threatening. So here are the layers. The epithelium, it's sort of like its support unit for strictly the lining. And the lining, everybody, simple columnar with goblet cells. And those goblet cells are enhanced. They have what are called microvilli, tiny, tiny areas, tiny, tiny projections that increase their surface area. It's all about surface area. The lamina propria, and my personal favorite layer, the muscularis mucosa. It's a little layer of adaptable, smooth muscle. You're going to love this. I'll show it to you. Now I'll go back. See it? Here's the simple columnar cells. They form these little pits which open into glands in the stomach. A different name in the small intestine, they're called crypts. You have the lamina propria, which has lymphatic tissue, houses some of the glandular elements, etc. And then you have this layer of smooth muscle. It's kind of interesting. And then the submucosa has more glands, blood vessels, nerves, etc., etc. What I love about it's this existential relationship I have with food. When the food enters your alimentary canal, that muscularis mucosa is triggered by receptors, stress receptors, to actually embrace the food. It exhibits, I love that. It's like when you put the food in, it's like oh, thank you. Surrounds it, embraces it, hugs it, has an intimate relationship. It's like dinner, taking you out to dinner first. I'm not sensing as much excitement. We are what we eat. And so, in the submucosa, all the supportive, beg your pardon, the submucosal layer here, a lot of supportive structures, and interestingly enough, nerve supply. We call it an enteric system, a gut brain. It has a nerve supply that's part of the submucosa to control all of these activities, and has a nerve supply here that controls the activity of what's called the muscularis externa, my enteric nerve plexus, and as you can see down here, they have in the submucosa, they have yet another, a submucosal nerve plexus. Interestingly enough, you can see the abundance of blood vessels. It doesn't require oversight. Sympathetic nervous system can slow it down. Parasympathetic can ramp it up. It's not essential. It works on its own. With those surgeries, not once, but twice, they have taken a section out of the vagus nerve, which goes to my stomach, to stop it from making acid. They've sectioned it, which means it's not snipped it. It's taking a piece out so it doesn't grow back together. I'm still not missing any meals. You get the idea. The nervous system takes care of itself. The overrides are basically sympathetic and parasympathetic, but can function in their absence. Maybe not as well, but function. So the submucosa has all underlying lining areolar connective tissue, the nerve plexus. Lots of elasticity. So when it's stretched out, it comes back. They've taken out half my stomach twice. By my math, that means I should have a quarter of a stomach left. Which means, and a typical empty stomach has the volume of about a quart that can expand to a gallon. But when it's completely empty, it's down to just a couple of ounces. The interesting thing is it continues to stretch. When people have stomach surgery because they want to lose weight and they've eaten too much, called bariatric, and I don't even know if they do it still the same way, they cinch what's left of the stomach. They kind of tie it in such a way that it can't stretch out again. Not so with mine. Mine wasn't about that. So at my second surgery, post-operatively, I weighed 167. That was, it's like 50 plus pounds that I'm less now. When I was on keto, I was down to 177. And that was 3 years ago, and I should go back. So segmentation and peristalsis, where the skeletal muscle, not the skeletal, the muscularis externa, which are smooth muscles, where they thicken, they form valves we call sphincters. Basically, we don't control them. The only sphincter with regard to digestive is the external sphincter in the anal rectal area, because that's about defecation. So the lining is moist. The only area is principally the esophagus. And maybe as it's finally getting all the way out where it becomes adventitious, some of the retroperitoneal have a combination. Adventitious, a dry lining, secures it in place. Same illustration. The circulation we talked about before. We talked about the hepatic portal circulation. When I cover it here, I cover it in physiology, so I'm not covering it in anatomy. Basically, it's that series of three vessels, the celiac, the superior, and inferior mesenteric. Remember, one alimentary canal, one set of blood vessels, not bilateral and symmetrical. All the blood comes back to be really processed for the most part in the liver by way of that portal. And portal systems means you go from capillaries in the bowel to a vein, to capillaries in the liver, to a vein, to the vena cava. And this is the gut brain, does everything itself. They have a variety of pictures. These are reflexive. They work on pressure, pH, and various chemical and irritants. So as soon as you put something in, things start to happen. As soon as you go wherever home is or wherever you're going to eat, as soon as you walk in there, smell something that's good, all of a sudden your brain is starting, I'm getting ready to eat. So these changes that's supersedes it. That's what we call it the cephalic phase. That's physiology. Not doing it. So basically mechanical, as you can see, osmolarity, the concentration of materials, whatever they are, as long with pH and mechanical stretching are the big players. And then certain substrates will trigger certain things like fats, whatever we eat. Most of our diet is fairly good because we're a wealthy country. And wealthy countries eat more proteins than they should. And, tend to eat more like my favorite diet, simple carbs and long chain fatty acids. I'm thinking like pumpkin pie with whipped cream. Ice cream? You can go every day at Costco when you get to the pumpkin pie season. It's like $7 for this giant pie that would fill the top of the desk. Okay. So we're okay. Not a lot here. My part is going to come later. Yes, you have a mouth and a tongue. The salivary glands, you have 3 sets. One on each side. Parotid, mostly serous. Submandibular, mostly serous. Sublingual, a little more mucousy. They're really responsible for keeping things moist. They have antibacterial effects. They are hypotonic, so they start to work on things. Additionally, it's where we start to digest starches and fats. We don't touch starches again until they get into the small intestine. Fats, we get work on a little bit in the mouth and a little bit in the stomach. Proteins don't get started and you'll get this in physiology, until you get to the stomach. And then all of them effectively complete digestion and eventually are broken down to their smallest particle. Proteins all the way to amino acids, carbohydrates to simple monosaccharides, okay, that kind of stuff. Very, very straightforward. So that's the mouth. I really don't do it. The tongue plays a role in all of this, and the lining is different. In the tongue and in the esophagus, you have stratified squamous. It's protective. Okay? The transition to simple columnar, as soon as it enters the stomach, you'll see a slide. And all this type of stuff. I don't ask a question. The frenulum is that little piece that's between your tongue and your cheek, and under your tongue, you have a lingual frenulum. And some people, when they say they're tongue-tied, sometimes you have to snip it. Some people just have this, ridiculous tongue. Can lick their eyebrows. Don't bother with it. Don't bother with it. These are all things. I don't know if you emphasize them in your lecture. Learn about them. The uvula is the guys that's hanging down. Big problem with that was when it gets inflamed with infection, because that can really cause trouble. There it is, hanging down. And teeth. And you know about the tongue, skeletal muscle, cranial nerve. It kind of gets it together. And most of the muscularity in the tongue and the pharyngeal constrictors that surround the pharynx are all about swallowing. Once you get into the esophagus, food passes because of the action of those muscles. It's active. When it gets to about the juncture between the upper 2/3 and the lower third, a little bit more than halfway down, that's when peristalsis starts. You transition from skeletal to smooth muscle. And after that, it's all smooth muscle. Not doing the taste buds, they were special senses. Not doing the tonsils, they were immune. Not doing the tongue, here's the saliva, what it does. And so they are the big salivary glands are really important. Okay. And here they are. The largest, if you're wondering, is the parotid. Parotid is a big player. We talk a little bit about mumps and micro. That's why mumps is classified as digestive, virus with digestive presentation. It targets this. It targets other glands. It can target reproductive structures. But the big player with most kids, and now you don't see it because of MMR, measles, mumps, and rubella. There it is. Well, so like illustration wise, you can see that sublingual, submandibular, parotid. This is more, to me, it's more immune system, but it's hypotonic, so it's pushing water in. And then and notice a lot of chemicals that start lysozyme breaks apart gram positives. IgA is, you learned about an immune, it's an antibody. There's a certain amount of waste products that are there. A lot of defensins, which are generic antibiotics. Nitric oxide from nitrates also plays a role. So there's a lot going on there. Okay, and I don't do teeth. I don't do teeth. I don't have any teeth. I have 6. I told Sadie, I go to the dentist, I just leave them. It's like dropping your car off. Why my beautiful wife is doing with me, I don't know. I think I told you. Years ago, she told me the 2 things that attracted her were intelligence and wit. And at least I had one of those. And I have half of the other. Half of it. The only downside is she's not a big fan of the Three Stooges. Which bothers me. Slightly. No. Oh. That wasn't from her, that was from my son. Not the one in the middle of the ocean. All right, so those are all teeth. We're not doing them. We're not doing them. Are you happy now? Yes. We should move on. Okay, so there's a certain, why you have to do this is, for those in nursing, it's NCLEX type stuff. Okay, I don't know that there'd be a whole lot of this in biomedical engineering, to tell you the truth. I always think that's more orthopedically or cardiac oriented, but I could be wrong. I don't know about so much about GI, but it's in the curriculum, so it's part of it. Obviously for bio majors, we get into it in quite a bit of detail. So as I said, we did the pharynx as a shared system with respiratory, the constrictors, stratified squamous, the esophagus. It's nothing more than, nothing happens. It's just moving the food along actively and then by smooth muscle, without, sort of without overwhelming control. So it's involuntary controls. It ends where it penetrates the diaphragm. The diaphragm has 3 openings. It has an opening for the vena cava, coming back to the heart, an opening for the aorta, going down, and it has an opening for the esophagus. So we call those openings hiatus or hiati, the esophageal hiatus, and that's where, when we have part of the stomach, because of pressure or diet or age or just unknown weakness, they have a thing called a hiatal hernia. They are, and it isn't just in old people. Babies have them. So sometimes there's a structural defect that allows, and what a hernia is, everybody, is when a peritoneal structure goes where it shouldn't. If it goes up into the diaphragm toward the thoracic cavity, hiatal hernia. If it's going through the umbilicus or from a surgical incision anteriorly, we call that an incisional or an umbilical hernia. The one you hear the most about going through the inguinal ligament, if we look at it in reproductive, that's the so-called rupture or sports hernia. Even though it's more frequent in men, it doesn't preclude women not having it. Women get the sports hernia. So there's a lot. The one who just texted me from working with automobiles and lifting stuff had 2 of them, and they had to put surgical mesh in, which isn't a great idea. It was about 10 years ago. So the sphincter controls that flow. And if it doesn't work, it keeps, understand that the esophagus isn't designed for this hydrochloric acid pH 1 to 2 acidity coming from your stomach. The esophagus is designed for neutral. When it goes up here, it damages it, can lead to esophageal cancer, esophageal bleeding, esophageal ulceration is a diagnosis you don't want anybody to have because you're not going to survive. Okay, so here you are. The glands are just moisturizing. Again, it's skeletal superiorly mixed in the middle, smooth and adventitia. And it's like this. It's one of the. It's like that hose they used to have on TV. You can put this 100-foot hose in your pocket. Remember they used to advertise that on TV? You can get them at Home Depot. And so imagine all of these expand. When you take a look in renal, which we'll do next week, the bladder, the ureters look very much like this. And in these little nooks and crannies, that's where kidney stones get trapped. Cause spasm. We call that urethral colic. So food can get stuck in there as well, but less likely. This is the transition. This is the juncture. Stratified squamous non-keratinizing, simple columnar with goblet cells. Those indentations here and here that I'm tracing out, those are called gastric pits. And at the bottom of them are the glands that make the acid I'll tell you about briefly, hormones, etc., etc. And so reflux, GERD, term you're going to hear about in nursing, is like this. A lot of things cause it. The fact that you have it doesn't mean you're going to have it for a lifetime. It's not that any of you would ingest alcohol during class. Joking. I was so troubled by the picture of my daughter and my granddaughter at the bar together. She turned 21 December 3rd. That was troubling. I know where you guys went. Help me. Lord, help me. So, again, it can be a real problem. These are the phases. This is physiology. We're not doing it. The stomach is perfectly stated. It's a temporary storage tank that starts protein digestion. This is where protein started. They also add some lipase to keep working on the fats. Nothing more with starches or carbohydrates. And the whole end product, what you put in, mixed with acid, killing bacteria, breaking down cell walls of plant stomach. And this mixing over and back for hours pounds this down to a pasty, hyperosmotic substance called chyme that is so acidic it squirts out in little half teaspoons at the end of the stomach. Okay? So we have the pyloric area and the pyloric sphincter. It comes out. It's kind of J-shaped, and because it expands to about a gallon, when it's not completely expanded, it folds. Again, that recurring theme of fan folding, but it forms ridges that have a wonderful term. They're called arrugae. It's kind of like ruffles have ridges. Nobody eats crisps, as my British friends would say, chips or crisps. So it's divided. It's anatomical. 4 parts. Where the esophagus enters, the cardia, because it's close to the heart. The fundus, a dome shape that's underneath the diaphragm. When we get to the uterus, it also has a fundus. The body, the main portion, that's where the mixing occurs. And then it begins to narrow as it gets to the pylorus, and it churns quite a bit, and then the sphincter is there. Voila. The difference here, a third layer. Circular, longitudinal, doesn't look that way. Lesser curvature on the bend here, greater curvature here. The big deal is this oblique layer. There's the rugae, over and back, over and back, over and back. And it's as though you took a pin meat tenderizer. Have you ever seen one of those things? They come out and it's like multiple pins that you put into meat, like if you're making, food moment, chicken fried steak. I have eaten chicken fried steak in Stephenville, Texas. Delicious. Stephenville rodeo. The couple, the dad of the gal, well, he had a small ranch, like 800 acres. Yeah, I thought I was in a movie. Lovely people. Moving on. So we have that. That's there. Okay. There's what it looks like in situ, greater and lesser curvature. The mesenteries, there's a lesser one called the lesser omentum between the liver, which is somewhat above it and an anterior to it. But the greater curvature has, it's almost like, think of it as like an apron coming down this way. And what that is a layer of fat that almost lays over the small and large intestine, protecting it. Surgically, bane of a surgeon's existence, a general surgeon, when you do abdominal surgery, is one word: adhesions. And it tells you everything. These are designed to move freely all the time. If they adhere to one another because you've sacrificed those layers or created rough areas that will, it's bad news. Surgeon has to go back in, find a way to separate it, put something in between. That too, if it adheres to the anterior wall of the peritoneum. You can't predict scar tissue. Adhesions are bad. Okay, that's why my surgeries took. I'm telling you this. You're going to see it for you in nursing with patients. It's tough for my first wife to sit there for 8 hours, not once but twice, waiting to hear from me, waiting to hear if I was going to be coming down, rather than going in a different direction. Okay. And again, autonomic, and then it has the four tunics. The oblique is the big difference. Simple columnar. These pits, these multiple indentations, are where the digestive juice. This is it shows you it here. There's four types of cells. Okay. In addition to the simple columnar cells that line the stomach, up here, as you get farther down, you're going to see there's something called a mucous neck cell. We really don't know what it means up here. So you have the regular mucosa, you have these mucous neck cells, slightly different. You have an abundance of these that they're depicting in this blue, called parietal cells. They make hydrochloric acid effective. They actually are proton pumps. If you know somebody who takes Nexium or Prilosec over the counter, they are proton pump inhibitors. That's what they work on. They prevent protons from being pushed out. There's a lot of it in physiology. How detailed you go, I do not know. As you continue to work your way down, the next level are called chief cells. Chief cells make pepsin. The parietal cells make something in addition called intrinsic factor, which is essential. They're the only cells that make it. Without that, we can't absorb vitamin B12 in the small intestine. If for some reason it's damaged, you have to get your either you have to get B12 by injection, and there's some nasal gel now. B12 is a pain because particularly for vegans, it's typically from animal products, and you have to go online, go on Amazon, they'll have B12 so you know somebody's vegan or if you are. And then all the way down in green, those are called G cells, not because they're green, but because the principal hormone they make is gastrin. Gastrin is an interesting hormone that works on the same thing where it's produced. It produced at the bottom of pits in the stomach. It causes the stomach to be active. As soon as food goes in there, it ramps up stomach activity. And it produces other hormones like histamine and an old friend of yours that was a neurotransmitter, serotonin. So much. I love this. So if you didn't think histamine, everybody says, oh, I take antihistamines like Zyrtec for my allergies. I do. Well, that blocks a pathway, and then there's even antacids that they've had some problems they had to pull from the market that block what are called histamine 2 receptors that cause the stomach to be very, very active. there's a whole lot to this. Hydrochloric acid, nature's protein, breaks down cells, great for bacteria, intrinsic factor. Chief cells make pepsinogen, the inactive form. In the gut, hormones and enzymes are secreted inactive and then they're activated, particularly proteolytic ones because they would auto-digest. They digest themselves. So if they got released where they should, like a hole in your stomach, they gobble up proteins. They don't just gobble up proteins in food. They gobble up proteins everywhere. They're very and some more fat digestion. So these are the hormones, gastrin, something called somatostatin, which plays a role in slowing down growth hormone and getting insulin ready to work. When we eat, insulin is the big player. When we utilize carbs as an energy source. When you use growth hormone, you're utilizing fats as an energy source. It's a little bit different. So they kind of play a little tug of war. If the insulin's busy, growth hormone isn't. When you get into the details, things called insulin-like growth factors, which we're not going to do. And the pepsin is activated by hydrochloric acid from its inactive form to its active form, which positively feeds back and keeps the train going. A lot of tight junctions, a lot of bicarbonate, doesn't seep. Every 3 to 6 days, lining cells in your stomach, and even faster in your large intestine. Billions of cells every day. Every day. I don't ask you about the Helicobacter pylori. It's not true. If they said most gastric cancers caused by Helicobacter, I'll buy that. But when you talk about ulcers, I was tested. I can't even tell you how many. 90% of us have it. I don't have it. I had ulcers that nearly killed me. I had 12 of those. I never do anything small. That's Helicobacter pylori. Pernicious anemia, absence of B12. I'm sure you don't need to know that. Different phases. That's physiology. All that kind of stuff. Enterogastrones. So they do that for you. This is physiology. This is how we make hydrochloric acid. It's something called chloride shift. And the blood becomes very alkaline. Bicarbonate trades places with chloride, both negatively charged. And they go into it. If you do it in physiology, great. If you don't. And it spurts out little half. We're getting there. I'm thinking 10 more minutes, 15. Can you handle it? Because you're all excited. So he's just showing it to you. Okay? And this is what happens if you overflow it or eat too fast. Vomiting, irritants, toxins. Vomiting is protective in nature. I shouldn't tell you this. With alcohol, quickly causes you to vomit. Alcohol slowly does not. A now deceased friend of mine used to start drinking beer when he wasn't treating patients, of course. And we'd hang out together. He started like 10 in the morning and go to 10 at night, never stop. Slowly. God bless. He served the country well. He was a medic in the Navy, a Navy corpsman attached to Marines in Vietnam and on the DMZ between North and South Korea during the Vietnam era. God bless. I'm sure there's a special place in heaven. So all of those, and this is what happens when you lose that acidity when you vomit. You tend to get something called alkalosis. Alkalosis is not nearly as common as acidosis, but it can be a big problem. The liver is the processing plant, detoxifies, makes proteins, glucose into glycogen. It's busy. Its big area in digestion is it makes something called bile, which is made from cholesterol. Fats are not bonded. We don't need enzymes to break the bond. Fats are single units that come together because they like each other. You have to have something to get in between them. That's what bile does. The gallbladder, non-essential, stores the bile. It can be a problem. If it works fine, mine does, fine. A lot of people are troubled by it. Sometimes it's heredity, sometimes it's age, sometimes it's diet. There's other factors that are involved. My daughter-in-law, because she went through in vitro on 3 different occasions, the second time when they had my granddaughter, she had so many of these cholesterol-based fertility drugs that her gallbladder went redline within a day or two. She was still in the hospital after a significant bleeding. So we almost lost her. Okay. And so that's the gallbladder stores it, concentrates it. If we don't have it, the liver can take care of it. That's why you can remove them. And the pancreas, essential. It's all about digestive. For our digestion, it's about enzymes. Its other is the endocrine function of insulin and glucagon, which you did in endocrine. So the liver is the largest gland. Every part of the liver is the same. I don't care about falciform ligaments or round ligaments. They're really bits of embryologic tissue that have formed and caused it to be divided anatomically. I mean, it's nonsensical. If you sample, when you do a liver biopsy, it doesn't matter if you get it here, 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 here. The liver looks like the liver everywhere, wherever you can access. It's the only way you can truly diagnose things like hepatitis and cirrhosis. You can, to some extent, the extent of their damage to the liver. You can certainly do antibody levels for hepatitis C or for other liver viruses. So it looks like this gallbladder is down here on the undersurface toward the inside, bony posterior. There it is. So you can see it. This area where it's got a big notch from the big vessels, okay, in it is what's called, very important, you'll see a better illustration, called the porta hepatis. It's got portal vein coming in where it gets its name, hepatic artery for nourishment where it gets its name, and coming out bile ducts, okay, that are bringing the bile. So you have 2 things going in, and effectively what happens, the food that you've ingested that's gone into the portal vein kind of percolates through, kind of just passes through over and back, up and down throughout the liver, and gets processed. Once it's processed, it's all collected centrally, goes from outside to inside, you'll see. And then it ends up flowing into what are called hepatic veins. Portal hepatic vein is entry. The hepatic veins are exits. They go to the inferior vena cava, and we all know where that goes back to the right atrium. So the hepatic artery and vein enter the liver at the porta hepatis, but it is different. The hepatic vein, that's the portal hepatic vein. So they have it slightly wrong. The hepatic duct is the outgoing, and then anatomically you have the cystic duct, and then eventually these 2 come back together after it exits the gallbladder, and it's called the bile duct. I just use bile duct. It's easier. So they're kind of like coming, bile duct is really here, coming out where they're pointing. So you have a duct that goes in, but eventually it's just temporary storage. It's kind of like the overflow tank, which mine blew in my car for your antifreeze. So inflowing hepatic portal vein, hepatic arteries. This is the vena cava making a big indentation. Here's the hepatic veins flowing out. It's all because of the anatomy. Capillaries are called sinusoidal. And I'm gonna do a little bit more of that and let you guys go, and I'll dictate the rest in a second. And so it's a series of hexagons where they have little branches called a triad, a little branch of the artery, a little branch of the vein, and a little branch of the bile duct. And so in a biopsy, that's normal. If these are distorted, that's the start of liver disease. They all go from the outside flowing to the inside, and all these little nooks and crannies with sinusoidal capillaries that are big openings, they're very, very leaky, and it percolates, meaning it just kind of drizzles through, kind of comes back. And we used to make, before we had drip coffee, we had percolate. You go to like a place where they have that big coffee urn, that's percolated coffee. It's drip is just so much easier today. Lots of white blood cells, antigen presenting cells. This is a great illustration. It's on the test, where this is the points of the triad of the hexagon. The portal vein, the artery to supply, all the cells are identical. They're called hepatocytes. And going in the other direction, these are going toward the center, going back to the periphery is the bile that's being made. So they have lots of smooth, much more so than rough, because they are big with fat storage and fat and detoxification. That's smooth. endoplasmic reticulum. They have bile salts, which are made from cholesterol, and the breakdown product you might remember from the blood of heme, which we have to get. We can't. We can recycle the iron. We can recycle the globin. We can't recycle the heme, so it has to be expelled. Eventually, it's made into bilirubin, and that colors our urine and our feces that are there. So there's a bunch. And then there's a special circulation where 95% of those bile salts are recycled. So it's a very useful use of cholesterol. And they go through it there. And normally when you get it's viruses, drugs, poison mushrooms, all part of it, the big player, alcohol, alcohol, alcohol. To have cirrhosis, you require serious drinking. I basically drink once. That's what I recommend. Or just go out. I went alcohol free. It doesn't matter to me. The difference is this: you would have to have, for instance, a bottle of booze every day, probably a pint of hard stuff every day, a bottle of wine every day, probably a 6-pack or 2 every day for 10 years. That's about when you're going to transition. That's some very serious drinking. It's hard to get somebody to stop. If you can, Alcoholics Anonymous is a wonderful program. How do you know if someone's an alcoholic? Same way, I'm an expert on addictive diseases. I didn't smoke for 40 years for nothing. If they're going out in the middle of the night because they ran out of beer and they're heading to Sheets, I would do that for cigarettes. Then you know I'm feeling around in my pocket to see when if I'm running low, do I have to run out now in the middle of the night? That's it. Where you're governed by its availability. So you know somebody who likes to have a beer or 2 at night. We all say we like that so and so likes their beer. If one day we're out of it, they just kind of go, I'll get more tomorrow. It's not driven. We now do live liver transplant. Again, the gallbladder. The big problem, it's got these little honeycomb folds, nooks and crannies, and they can get stones. And there's a lot of different things that make stones. Maybe you'll go into them. What happens is they block the passage. Bile backs up, goes into your bloodstream. The result is a yellowish coloring called jaundice. We see that sometimes in newborns when they have ABO incompatibilities. We can reduce it in a newborn with ultraviolet light. If we see it in an adult, there's a problem. The blockage could be at the pancreas level. The blockage could be at the liver. It could be from cirrhosis. It could be from hepatitis. All of those. And we can dissolve those, not just with drugs. Lithotripsy is non-invasive. High-frequency sound waves in like a water bath. And you do the same thing for kidney stones. And there's not much to say about the pancreas other than it's retroperitoneal. It's in the cup of the duodenum, and that's because that's where right where it kind of forms this cup. Duodenum is about 10 inches long. The common bile duct is there. And so its exocrine phase is the digestive. Its endocrine is glucagon and insulin. That's not part of it. This is our part, but to me it's mostly physiology. So they all join this duct, do a variety of chemicals that facilitate physiologically your digestion. And it's alkaline in nature. There's a lot of bicarb. It offsets the acidity of chyme because the small intestine, what this is leading into, this stuff is pH controlled alkaline, pH 8, whereas the stomach pH 1 or 2. All these, that's physiology. We'll get into all of that. And this is more of the anatomy. And this is really what I call the common bile duct. Now they call it the hepatopancreatic ampulla. It's got a sphincter. They just call it it used to be called the sphincter of Oddi, capital O, DDI. There's a smaller one also. And you always see this illustration. That's why this is that vital area. For me, you see how it's open as though the stomach it was detached. That's what they did to mine. They take it away from the stomach, they fold it over, just kind of leave it sitting out there in the wind. And they took further down where the jejunum is and created a new passageway to the stomach. Very famous procedure called Billroth too. So famous, I had it done twice. And everybody, the big players there are secretin and cholecystokinin, and you're done. I will do C, which is small and large intestine anatomy. Take me about a half an hour. I'll send it to you. Go. Voila. You want to stay here and I can talk longer.